Right then, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you and good afternoon to you, Jonathan, as well.
Hi there.
Right, today, as you will see, we've done a slightly different way of doing things with a few visuals in order to try and provide you with a bit more of an immersive experience. Unfortunately, I believe that every man and his dog, wife and child are currently using Zoom, so the bandwidth available is somewhat limited. So you'll have to bear with us on these visuals in the way that we're actually putting them out there. So it's going to be in this manner, and Jonathan's obviously going to be talking us through them. Now, thank you ever so much for joining us today for the 8th of our webinars. Unfortunately, last week I did actually say it was our 8th webinar when actually it was our 7th. So I was getting a little bit ahead of myself in the wake of everything. But thank you ever so much for joining us again. So here we are again with Jonathan, one of my good friends, talking about one of Britain's best known 20th century artists, Lawrence Stephen Lowry. So Jonathan, what drew you to Lowry as an artist?
I think what drew me to him was that he's quite singular. We talk about Impressionism and other schools of art, and Lowry produced work which was unique to him. It didn't owe anything to anyone and didn't spawn a school of painting. So it's peculiarly sort of robust and English. He didn't have any students, although he was a student for a long time. And there are no comparisons, and his legacy, if you like, is his work. There's no school of Lowry. There are people who try to mimic him or copy him or work in his style, but it just stands alone. I just like that.
I totally see what you're saying. I think when you speak about it in that way, there are, and I hate to use the term copyists, but I think everyone that came after Lowry was effectively a copyist as opposed to, as you say, in the same school as.
Exactly right, yes.
Fantastic. Now, in terms of Lowry, we see him being spoken of, and we see, him being, obviously considered, even from times when he was alive, as such a fantastically important artist. Do you think it's that kind of singularity that kind of draws people to him?
He never forget, he's from Manchester, so he's very much a northern man born and bred, and the way up north he would be treated was as a curiosity to some extent. So even his neighbours thought of him as rather strange and not particularly gifted, and I think pretending to be an artist rather than being an artist, which was always obviously very unfair, but not untypical.
Now, we've got a lovely selection of slides that you've provided to us today, Jonathan. Can you tell us a little bit more about these images and which kind of sale and where these images came from?
Sure, absolutely. I chose this because, for me, the pleasure of dealing with Lowry was that I got the opportunity to meet many of the collectors, and this particular group of images, 17 pictures in the auction altogether, which took place some time ago now, but a short enough time for us all to be still interested and the memory to be fresh. And in this particular case, they were bought by two child psychologists who befriended Lowry, Daphne and Lawrence with a W, Ives. And Lawrence, being the person that he was, very precise, I met him a few times, made notes on all of these pictures. So you have a direct interplay often between Lowry and Lawrence or his wife Daphne at each point. So you get a bit of an insight here, not just into why someone collects, but also some feedback from Lowry himself. So
let's just have a little bit of a look and then start going through some of these as well, whilst we're talking about the Ives. Certainly. Now, in terms of the Ives, what do you remember when speaking to them, what drew them to the Lowry collections?
Lawrence himself had bought for his parents a Lowry print as a gift one Christmas in the early 50s. And so he was aware of art and artists, and he was a well-read man. He was essentially a psychiatrist, as his wife was. And but he also was, like Lowry, an enthusiast for art and for music. Okay, so this picture we're looking at now, you and I, strangely, have been debating this for the past few days since you sent it over to me, of whether it is actually a boy or a girl. So what's your thought? Well, we're not the only ones to debate this. as Lawrence Ives wrote himself in his diary, that he went to visit Lowry one evening, and he was presented with this, and Lowry says, "What do you think?" And Lawrence says, "Well, obviously it's a girl." And Lowry equally stridently said, "Well, obviously it's a boy." So they started arguing the toss. But it's fairly androgynous, but it's clear that what Lowry was painting, and bear in mind it's from 1967, so it's sort of pop. The Beatles are around, it's a pop era, so here's a young lad. It probably is a boy, but somehow it ended up being called a girl, a lad with a sort of Beatles haircut and jeans and a scarf. Lowry's captured him.
But I think what's equally brilliant about it, because of the time it was, taken, is the fact that in that kind of late 60s period, women could be wearing trousers and have that kind of androgynous haircut as well. So I think the fact that we're even debating it really pours fuel on the fire of what's great about Lowry, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the 60s was, he had a long life, but the 60s was a godsend for Lowry, because all of these different things were happening that for many years people up where he lived just outside Manchester in Mottram, in a very gloomy house, which he more or less hated from the moment he moved in. It was a bit more colourful, and people were beginning to look different, whereas prior to that they'd always looked the same. So you're right, it was, as a people watcher as Lowry was, this was fantastic.
Let's move on to the next slide, and this is one that I've seen some variations on, shall we say? But what can you tell us about this image specifically?
Well, this is again a direct purchase by Lawrence Ives from Lowry, and results from yet another meeting. Lawrence told me, I spent some time with him. He lived about half a mile from Lowry's house, and on one evening he pops in, and Lowry starts rifling through drawings, and it appears, I didn't know this until I talked to Lawrence, that Lowry would keep his drawings in folios, about 20 or 30 in a pack, and you just wonder why. And Lawrence's theory was that they were arranged in what Lowry considered to be quality or appropriateness, if there is such a word, for the person he was talking to.
Were these preparatory works, or were they just literally just sketches?
Some were, yeah. Lowry's style, many artists make preparatory sketches for works which then become final works. That was not Lowry's way at all. You will very often get a pencil drawing of a subject and an oil drawing, an oil painting of the same subject, sometimes in various sizes, but the two don't exist side by side. The pencil drawing isn't a sketch for the picture, whereas with many artists you'll get preparatory sketches, then the finished thing. They both stand alone. He told Lawrence that drawing for him was like a therapy, and this drawing was bought by Lawrence. It was unframed, so Lawrence took it to Davies, who were the framer that Lowry used down by, for those of you who live in and around Manchester, Davies was around the back of Kendal Milne, big department store, now House of Fraser. And he handed over the drawing, and Mr. Davies said straight away, "Oh, I know who that is. That's George Glossop." Lawrence Ives said, "Well, how do you know that?" "Well, I've seen him. I could tell straight away." He framed it, and then it seems that what Lowry liked to do was to see drawings once they'd been framed. So he popped back to see Lowry with a now framed drawing, and told Lowry the story about it being a portrait of George Glossop, who was a hat maker, was where Lowry bought his hats and where Davy also bought his hats. And immediately Lowry said, no, I wouldn't do that. No, I wouldn't be cheeky enough to paint a portrait. And so Lawrence said, "Okay, fine." So Mr. Ives said, "Well, I'll just leave it there then." And just as he was leaving, Lowry winked at him and said, "Yes, but it's a good likeness. This is curious sort of interplay."
Oh, how lovely! So that it's almost a bit of mystical kind ofness to his kind of drawings.
Yeah.
I think what people loved about Lowry was the fact that he did, in his own way, draw real life and draw real life situations. So the fact that he did draw this Milner, Milner rather, and try and kind of you know, but then deny it and actually more or less admit to it straight away afterwards.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's something which I hadn't, until I met Mr. Ives, I hadn't really reckoned quite where all of these images don't come from his imagination. They're things, they're people and things that he sees as he wanders the streets. And, you know, so you're quite right. He just was, and it's quite cheeky, quite tongue-in-cheek, but quite funny to know, and quite human.
Was there? I mean, I mean, a lot of people will look at Lowry pictures now, and especially some of the larger pieces, and you know, the famous ones, the football games, the Mills, and things like that, and look at them with a certain air of seriousness. But was there a touch of tongue in cheek? Was there a touch of light-heartedness to his work?
Yeah, there is here in some cases, but there are some pieces that are just devastating to look at, particularly.
Yes.
Yeah, but the bleakness and the anguish is extraordinary. There's a picture called Father and Two Sons, which is exactly that. It's a large canvas. It's about 30 by 50 inches, which had, I remember, first belonged to a chap called Monty Bloom, who had found it tucked away in the Fair Gallery. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the picture changed hands at one point, and I went to see it in a house in East Sussex. And the owner was asking me whether I could arrange to sell it for him, which I was happy to do. And I went up to see it. And he said, the one problem with the picture is, I asked him, that's right. I said, well, why do you want to sell it? So my kids are terrified of it. And of course, when you look at it in one way, it's a picture of a father and two sons. But in another way, it is an absolutely anguished portrait of these who are sharing probably the loss or the death of someone. And it's so intense. He told me the kids wouldn't pass it. They'd rather wet themselves than walk past it in the nighttime. So yeah, there's something jokey like this, but some incredibly intense work, probably from around the period his mother died. I think that's probably where they come from.
Fascinating. Let's move on. So this again, Jonathan, what looks to be not atypical from what I can see of his his style. And I think there's another one that's fairly similar that's coming up slightly later. Yeah. What can you tell us about this?
Well, this and the other one are exceptionally rare. Lawrence Ives had bought two, as we see later on. They date from 1920. So at this point, Lowry is just coming to the end of his almost 10 or 12-year study. He studied at night school in Salford School of Arts because he was working during the day and had no other option. And these are, again, they're not caricature drawings. They are quite emotional, quite intense, and they're people that he has seen. They're more than likely people that he's seen at his art school. It's just signed LSL with his initials on the bottom right. And they're super rare things. I mean, something like this probably would make in between £15,000 and £25,000. They're you hardly ever see them. They're quite classical, but they're very typically Lowry.
No, I think you can almost, despite the fact that you can tell it's not his usual style, you can almost put that mark of Lowry on it, though. And I don't quite know why, but I think that's possibly the appeal of it.
Yeah.
Let's just.
It's just at the point. That last one is just at the point where he's beginning to find his feet, as it were. It is early, if you think about it.
Yes, certainly. Now, this one, again, we kind of get into the, not tongue-in-cheek, obviously a slight desperation for it. Whether you think it's somebody putting something in the bin or somebody retrieving something from the bin, I don't know. But what was your interpretation of this one?
Well, this one was given by Lowry to Mr. Ives' daughter, who's, I forget her name now. Let me just think. I've written it down somewhere. Joanna, that's right, Joanna Ives. And every year the Ives would go on holiday to France and they'd come back with something for Lowry. And on this particular occasion, they'd come back from France with a painting that they'd seen on their holiday in Chablis, painted by an old lady. So Joanna was dispatched to walk up to see Mr. Lowry. They lived about half a mile away, handed over the picture, and then in a very northern way, it's a hospitable thing. Lowry was absolutely adamant that then she couldn't go without him giving her something. that was not the intention, but that's what actually happened. So this drawing was given by Lowry to Joanna, and she was given the choice of...
Is that dated 70? When's that dated?
This one is from 1971.
So at this point, you know, he was still actually he was still active, but he was obviously pretty famous by this point. And for him to be handing out works was obviously somewhat of a scarce action, one would have thought.
Yeah, but it's I don't know whether you've I've come across this many times where you go to visit someone, and to somehow even up the score, you're given something. So in other words, nobody owes anybody anything, and I think that's where it's coming from.
I think I've generally experienced that with farmers, and maybe getting a few or a bit of meat, but not with paintings or drawings. That's for sure.
But Larry was like that. He wanted to sort of make sure that so everything was good. He obviously was troubled by various things, and so someone bringing him a gift had to be repaid with another gift. And she was offered the choice of two, and chose this one. And apparently the guy is rummaging. It's in St. Peter's Square in Manchester, and he's rummaging in the bins for cigarette ends. And it's about 16 by 11, so it's quite a decent size. 16 by 11 inches. That's
a good size for a sketch.
Yeah.
One could be considered to be a sketch, certainly. Now, again, we're getting into what I would consider to be kind of almost not the blueprint, but certainly establishing kind of in terms of what some people will probably best know Lowry for, which are his kind of very industrial scenes. So what can you tell us about this, Jonathan?
Yes, this is drawn only 4 years after the head we were looking at before, the sort of caricature head. It's a view from Salford Technical College, which is basically the view that Lowry would have had while he was studying, although he's actually past studying, but it's a view from memory. And it's a chimney which is no longer there. What's amazing about this is the strength of the chimney, which takes up the entire view. And if you think about it, it's a bit weird that the chimney should have no beginning and no end. It simply stretches from one end of the drawing to the other. The drawing is 22 by 13 inches, so quite large, dated 1924. And as you say, it is recognisably Lowry. So from that head that we just saw, this is the next level. But unless you can see it, which of course we can't, but I remember when I saw it, the chimney it has a sheen to it. It's extraordinary, almost like a patina, like a depth, as Lowry just went over and over and over that chimney with a very soft pencil. So it's almost glossy. It's extraordinary, and probably one of the best drawings I think I've ever seen by him.
No, but I didn't realise that where he actually studied, he would have this view, and I'm sure you probably agree then that his foundation for this work was obviously kind of inbuilt to where he learned. And would you say that's applicable?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was something, it was given as a gift by Lowry, this time to Daphne. Daphne had gone round to the house to help out and just tidy up, which the place was a tip. So you go in through the front door of Lowry's house. On the first room on the left was where he kept the frames and all bits of associated stuff and pictures he was working on. The right-hand side is where he worked. And in the middle was just a sort of an assembly of stuff. So she went to tidy up. And as a result was given this.
We've got an image actually of what his kind of his working lifestyle seemed to look like. It's obviously a little bit later, but does that give? Would you say that's an representation of his daily work?
That's absolutely it in a nutshell. He worked at night. I don't know why, but he did. So he worked at night and often into the early hours. And when the Ives used to visit, and in fact he came to them, they worked out, Mr. Ives worked out that he had probably seen Lowry once a month for 20 years.
Gosh.
And they'd visit either around 8:30, he'd come and eat with them, or they'd go and see him. He didn't really cook, so if you went to him, you didn't get anything. And it went to the Ives. And Lawrence, there's always been a lot of talk about what Lowry was like. I never met him, but Lawrence once or twice would just look like he was about to tell me what he remembers from their 20 years worth of meetings, and then would just stop.
I mean, because obviously they were both, psychologists, so they surely they had some kind of viewpoint on this, but obviously they didn't wish to divulge their thought process.
No, Mr. Ives, he sort of nearly did, and started, and then stopped himself. I guess once you start, then you start, and he occasionally he would start to talk a little bit, and there's some indication in some of these notes that he talks about the pictures that gives us some insight into Lowry's character. You might imagine that Lowry was always nice and always benign and kind and whatever else, which he mostly was, but like all of us, occasionally loses his temper every now and again.
And I imagine with an artistic temperament that I think both you and I have to deal with on a fairly regular basis.
Yes.
I can imagine he did have those dark periods, and obviously that's represented in a lot of his work. But let's have a look at another picture. We'll just go straight to this one, which is, we're getting to, I mean, I've seen a few ones, like this, and I think there's been a few that are of similar kind of ilk. Now, what can you tell us about this one, Jonathan?
Well, this particular one it's called Group of People. It's 7 by 6 inches, so the size of a paperback, more or less. It's quite tiny wee, but it's interesting because it's the first picture that Lawrence and Daphne Ives bought. The whole meeting thing came about that Lowry bought the horrible house, the Elms, in 1948, and the Ives moved to Mottram in 1958. And within a day or so, we're told that Lowry lived nearby. So Daphne popped up to see Lowry one night, didn't come back till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then Lawrence went the next day to see Lowry, and so their friendship began. But they were both on extended student salaries. So between Daphne and Lawrence, they had £500 a year to live. They were offered a gift. In fact, on the second visit, Mr. Ives was offered a picture, and he said, no, I don't want to take something as a gift. I want to pay for a picture. That doesn't sit well with me. And so Lowry amused himself. He had a curious pricing system. So this picture was priced by Lowry at £100, and bigger ones were more. So we've discovered through this that Lowry priced his pictures by size more than anything else. Drawings were cheaper. So this was £100. They bought it in, let me think now, 1959. And Lowry worked out that they, as a couple still studying, deserved a 2/3 discount. So it was £33 and 30 shillings, I think it was. So, I mean, basically exactly a third of the price. And that's the first one they bought.
But he obviously wanted people to enjoy his art, and I think as obviously people who are young students, was he very keen on younger generations and people who couldn't necessarily afford his full price art to actually own it?
I don't know. I think he wanted Lawrence to have this picture. He did. Certainly, Lowry was very fond of children. I think he liked the vibrancy of their activity. He never married. He never and didn't have children. And indeed, it's often thought that he was totally celibate. So he was separated in that respect. I don't think that he wanted to share his art. He realised its value, and he enjoyed people enjoying it and talking about it and seeing things in it that he himself perhaps couldn't see.
Fascinating. We'll come on to something that's a little bit not necessarily unusual. I think we've both seen sketches of a similar kind of subject matter. But what can you tell us about this harbour opening?
Well, this is part of a story that's at some point Lawrence Ives said to Lowry that he'd like a seascape. It was the only time that Lowry lost his temper with Lawrence, and Lawrence was completely befuddled by the whole thing. He couldn't see quite what he had said wrong, but he had said that he'd like a seascape, and Lowry had said, "Yeah, how dare you? You're taking advantage of me. If I wanted to give you a seascape, I would have done, and all this sort of blah. And Lawrence, you know, he's a health professional, a mental health professional, so he just sort of sucks it up really, and it's not troubles him, but it's stuck in his mind. And he forgot about it, but Lowry didn't. About 2 years later, he called Lawrence Ives up and said, "I've got that seascape." And Lawrence told me he'd almost forgotten all about this whole thing. But it wasn't this drawing to begin with. It was a seascape that, just to make the joke, Lowry had drawn or painted. It was an oil painting, that's right. It was an oil painting he'd painted on a matchbox. So it was the world's tiniest seascape. It was all white with a tiny black dot in the middle. So it was a ship at sea. And Lawrence said, "Well, no, I don't really want that. Thank you very much."
But again, we see that little bit of tongue-in-cheek from him.
Yes, but he loved the whole elaborate joke. There was another one that he painted 2 ships on a piece of card, which was again so tiny nobody wanted it, and then allowed Lawrence to choose something from the portfolio. Came up with this, which is a superb drawing of ships entering the Tyne. So this is just ruins on the banks of the Tyne as you come in. So it all ended well, but it's the only time they ever really fell out. So it's completely accidental. I don't think Lawrence Ives ever quite realised what the fuss was about, but perhaps just Lowry's having a bad day.
Fantastic. Let's just go on this one. This is one of my favourite ones that I've seen actually that we've actually been talking about. So tell us more about this.
Okay, fine. Let me just check with my notes. This is again a favourite. There's like all of them. There's a story attached to this one as well. This was another one that was chosen from one of the folders. It was bought in 1972, and they had gone along on one of the social visits, and it was in a folder that they weren't allowed to look into. I know this sounds weird, but they're looking in folder after folder of drawings and pull out not this but another one that Lowry says, "Oh no, that's not. That's in the wrong place. You can't have that one." And so it gets put away and put to one side. And after a while, they are given this one. So it's sort of a choice. And they bought it in 72. And it is, to you and I looking at it, it's an interesting group of people. And are they real people? Are they not? Well, as it turns out, they are. Lawrence Ives, immediately when he looked at it and started talking to Lowry about it, said, "Well, I think I recognise these children, and that chap with the moustache at the back, I've seen him." And Lowry didn't say anything for a few minutes, and then said rather reluctantly, "Well, yes, you're right, sir." He was called everybody sir. "You're right, sir. They're people in Stalybridge, which is Lowry's house is on the Stalybridge Road, and Stalybridge is another suburb of Manchester." And then said, "Well, I've seen all of these people, the children, the man, and even the dog exists." So it's not just a sort of jokey sketch of some weird looking people. They are all people that he's seen, not all together necessarily, but at various times, and he's popped them all into this drawing.
No, I really do like it. I think it's there is a touch of humour, but there's a touch of seriousness. I think it kind of encapsulates.
Yeah, it's 1967, this one, and Lawrence bought it in 1972. It's about, what is it? It's I think 16 by 11, so quite a good size too.
No, tremendous size, really. I'm going to kind of just, obviously we've got a lot of images here, but I'm going to just, obviously we're a little bit limited on time as to what we can go through. So I'm going to just pick a few of these things to actually just
maybe go to number 19. That's the core.
Well, that's the one I was just about to talk on, because I think it's a little bit more, I think when people think of Lowry, this is something that is very atypical of when he was kind of getting into style. And when do you think he started really exploring the very famous technique and the very famous style that he had? When in his career do you think this kind of became...
It's probably, his timing is really strange. That he's painting industrial landscapes. So close your eyes and think of Lowry, and you probably come up with this. To be honest, it's not a big picture. but it's a good size. It's 16 by 12 inches, so a very good size. And up to and including probably 1951, 52, he's generally painting industrial landscapes. But then sort of just stops. He never explains why, and I guess he just gets fed up of them. But imagine a situation where he is well known for industrials, and guess what? He isn't painting them anymore. And so when this picture was bought by Lawrence Ives in 1964, and was a request, he said, "Well, I'd like another picture from you." And so in 1963 they have that conversation. In 1964 this appears, and when Ives first asks whether he can have a picture, Lowry says, "I suppose you want an industrial." And Lawrence Ives said, "Well, actually, no, I don't really want an industrial. Maybe Sorry, I've just lost the signal. Hang on, I'm coming back.
Okay, no problem.
Right, okay. And so basically he said, "No, I'll have maybe a figure scene or something like that," and which pleases Lowry. But no, he does stop painting them. People come to see his industrials, and they've all gone, or he's stopped painting them. And these small pictures emerge from about 1955 right on then until the end of his life. There's many, many more of them in the 60s and the early 70s than anywhere else.
Okay, but so he actually carried on painting this industrial kind of scene. It wasn't just for a very small period of his life. Do you think it was through commercial popularity, or do you think it was because he enjoyed painting them?
It was, I think to some extent he had, what is he trying to do? He had got fed up of painting industrial landscapes. I think that was it, basically. And he wanted to move on, but somehow people wouldn't let him move on. And in the end, as an artist, every picture's got a bit of you in it. And in this particular picture, Lawrence Ives, when he was first given it, looked at it from a psychologist's point of view, and points out, for those of you, hopefully you can see, that the boy right in the middle at the bottom, who's looking at us from the picture, is Lowry as a boy. And then there's the figure in the doorway, who's quite hard to see, but there is a figure in the doorway looking out. That's Lowry as an old man. And then there's a little girl whose back to us, whose back is to us on the left-hand side. That's a little girl which appears in various pictures. And interestingly enough, when Lowry handed this one over, you can see in the centre left, there's a fence post, a slightly wonky looking fence post. And when Lowry asked what Ives thought of it, he said, "Well, I don't think the colour of the fence post is quite right. It needs strengthening." So obediently, Lowry went off and put a bit more red on it, and then signed it. And he was very keen, something which I hadn't really got, but Lowry was very keen for approval.
Okay.
So in the same way that poor old Lowry spent his entire life seeking approval from his mother, he then was somehow seeking approval for his art as well, which must make things doubly difficult.
So in keeping with this then, Jonathan, do you think it may have been a case that he would submit almost a first draft of an image to a client on a commission and say, "What do you think? Is there something you want me to change about it?" Do you think that's almost the case?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened in this case. Yes, he wasn't changing the overall composition, but he was willing to go into his room and strengthen the colour on the fence post, which is slightly to the right, the wonky post, just in front of the fence on the left-hand side. See, he wasn't bothered by mild criticism. I guess he wouldn't want to repaint the whole damn thing, but he was willing to change the colour on that, and willing to listen to the criticism.
Yes, interesting. Let's have a look at. So this is obviously Lowry in his studio, actually, yeah, conducting obviously what seems to be one of his industrial images. In terms of what the way in which he painted, was he particularly, were there a lot of things that were coming out of his studio at any one time? Was he particularly prolific in different periods?
He was always busy, and he was always, perhaps unlike other painters, he was always working on quite a large number of pictures all at the same time. And anything up to 40 or 50. So you can sort of see in this and other images that there are pictures all over the place. So if it's hanging on the wall, as you can see the one behind him, then it belongs to him. But anything that isn't hanging on the wall, so it's hanging on a mantle ledge or on the floor, is all work in progress. So everything that's an oil painting starts with a white ground. So that's the first thing that happens. So they're all painted with white, and then they get put away to dry. In some cases, amazingly, for up to 2 years for them to dry. He quite likes the idea of them developing a patina.
Okay.
But then when he's working, he'll work on 10 or 12 pictures in an evening. So picking them up, putting them down. And for those of you lucky enough to see the back of a Lowry, you can see his fingerprints on the, as it were, under the canvas support. There's a wooden support around the whole edge of the canvas. And if you're lucky, you can see just tucked underneath these little paint fingerprints, which I always look to see. So I'm looking for reassurance in a Lowry, as he's a much copied artist. I'm sometimes looking for fingerprints if I possibly can.
Gosh. Jonathan, we're getting near to the end of our allotted time on this, but I wanted to just talk to you about this collection that was obviously put together by the Ives. So when Lowry died, I think it was 1976 when Lowry died. I'm assuming did they stop collecting then, or did they carry on buying? Because obviously their lives must have been enriched that much by owning his work that they carried on buying it once he died.
Yes, they did. Lawrence and Daphne carried on collecting after Lowry's death because they loved having the work around them. And by that time, Lawrence Ives was quite well known locally as a buyer. So, being the sort of place it was, people would come to him and offer him things. And so, yes, he carried on probably until the early 80s, I think. I think 1981 was the last thing he bought. But by that time, he was buying either at auction or from people locally.
Okay, and so when this collection actually came up for sale, Jonathan, which obviously you were very fortunate enough to see, was this after a death of one of the pair, or was it just a case of they were moving things on?
But no, they were both. They were all alive, Daphne and Lawrence. They were in a care home because Lawrence had chronic asthma and Daphne had the same. And he wanted to have some level of control. Yes, he did die some years afterwards. This is 2000 when the sale took place. But Lawrence Ives, he was the sort of guy who wanted to see everything. In fact, that was a stumbling block in terms of selling it. He wanted to sell it. He was too poorly to come down to London, and therefore was inclined to do nothing at all. So I racked my brains to think how we could involve him and everybody in the sale. So it was pre-internet, so you couldn't do what we're doing now and webcast the sale. But I could put Lawrence Ives on the telephone, and so they had a speakerphone in the care home to listen to the sale as it was being played live. And for the first time, I did a video, an edited, professionally made video of the whole thing. So a video of the cataloguing, we videoed the preparation, the preview, the auction, the whole thing. And so they set up a big TV in the care home, and everybody watched it. It became a weekly event, I was told. They would gather together to watch the sale, and it actually was quite entertaining. It's the first time we'd done anything like that, but it answered the problem that he had, that he wanted to see it all happen. And you spend 20 years or more collecting, you want to see it happen.
Oh, certainly. I mean, was it one of the best collections of Lowry's that you've seen then, I'm assuming?
It was the first one in which I had ever got this sort of first-hand account of the purchase, and indeed one of the very few. There are collections, mostly belonging to men. Interestingly enough, there is only one lady collector I know of Lowry, but those collections were either formed after Lowry's death or through auction, and therefore separately, or through dealers and separately. So this is the first one, and probably there are other collections formed through friendships. But this was Lawrence Ives lived half a mile away, saw Lowry socially, and it really had a lot more connection to Lowry himself than any other I'd ever come across. And still,
there's a nice personal touch to it, and you feel like
exactly.
he gave them pieces that he wanted them to have.
Yes, exactly, and that I think is how the collection was assembled. It's unique, like all collections are, but that very direct connection between Lawrence Ives. He even gave Lawrence Ives' father a picture.
Really?
Yeah, his father dropped in one day to run an errand and was not allowed to leave until he had chosen a drawing.
How fantastic! Now, in obviously in Lowry's lifetime, he was incredibly popular. Did he die a rich man? Did he leave a huge inheritance to somebody down the line?
Yeah, he did. He had curious quirks. He had turned himself into a company. The tax regime, we often talk about tax, but in those days when he was making money, you were paying 87% tax if you got above £20,000 a year. So it's quite a chunk. And Larry hit on this idea of putting the checks that he had earned in a huge Xianlong bowl at the front of his living room, and thought, well, if he needed them, he could pop them in the bank. The revenue took another view that, as far as they were concerned, once the check was written, then that was income. Whether he decided to bank it or not was his problem. So yes, he was wealthy. He turned down a knighthood, an Order of Merit, and a CBE. So he was well recognised. And there was a retrospective in 1964 at the Tate Gallery. I think he was sort of curiously, not coy, but somehow enjoyed the fact that people recognised him physically as he's walking around the streets, that they recognised his skill and his art, but wanted to downplay it. It was almost, he was trying to distance himself from it in a way. He's quite a curious character.
It's interesting whether you can draw anything from his pictures into that kind of mentality, I suppose, isn't it? That distancing from reality kind of sighting. Yeah. I think
he didn't spend money. All of his suits and hats are the same. So he had half a dozen coats, half a dozen hats, each of which was exactly the same. And
but he did like art, though, didn't he? He did have some collections.
You found his weakness. The only thing he spent money on was art, and he was a member of this curious little group, the Rossetti Society, who loved the beautiful Rossetti women. He had 20 works by Rossetti, and he would quite cleverly sort of exchange them. So if he had a successful show at the Lefebvre Gallery, which all of his shows were successful, very often completely sold out, rather than get the money from Lefebvre would go to an auction or go to a dealer and buy him a Rossetti. And there is one which he paid £4,000 for. So in 1964, two things happened. Lowry paid 4,000 guineas for a Rossetti, Proserpine, which is a beautiful painting. And also one of his pictures made £1,600, which was a new world record in 1964. So he broke the world record and spent 4,000 quid. So it was quite good timing. So he was able to indulge his pleasures. He bought Lucien Freud. I guess if you sat down and worked out what L.S. Lowry is less likely to own, it would be a Freud, but trust me, he had a Freud. And William Etty, and his very good painter friend Sheila Fell, who was an alcoholic and was nearly always drunk. But for some reason, Lowry never drank in his life. They were great pals. He just drank orange squash, that was it, orange squash and tea. Whereas Sheila Fell was a great drinker.
Jonathan, we have to kind of broach the subject, I suppose, on values and how they have changed, obviously, since his death. And I think, obviously, the way in which modern interpretation kind of looks at Lowry's values. And what would you say about that?
Well, can we skip back to 19? That's the court. Sure, yeah. If you take that as an example, in 2000, the estimate there was 60 to 100,000. Bear in mind, the picture is 16 by 12, so good size. It made £157,000 in 2000. That same picture now probably is worth 250,000, maybe heading towards 300,000, maybe slightly more. Because, as you were saying, it's iconic, it's immediately recognizable. So that the more it looks like Lowry, the more people, the more dogs, the more buildings, and the more other things it has, the more valuable it is.
But I think it seems to me that he's one of those artists whereby it almost seems to have bypassed taste or trends, because he is so unique. And
Yep.
I think when you look at kind of different kind of schools or periods of art, certainly his just kind of bypasses everything in terms of what people are interested in, because there will always be a market for it. And obviously it's increasing, you know, as we speak about. And, you know, I've seen this, I mean, the strange phenomena that I've seen, I think, in the past few years is even the limited Lowry prints that once were kind of not laughed at, but, you know, it was as close as a lot of people were going to own you know, a Lowry. And even the signed prints these days, you know, in terms of value, you're talking in, you know, pretty much in the tens of thousands of pounds for a not brilliant print quality, but signed by him.
Yeah, yeah. The print market is one which is, I can remember in the late 80s that the same thing happened. A Lowry print in 85 was worth about £100, and suddenly by 89, 88, 89, it was 1,500. And then it went to 2,000, then 4,000, then dropped off again. And there's a neat little story which ties Lowry to the printmakers. The printmakers had asked him to sign, I think it was a limited edition of 400 prints. So that's quite a lot of signing to do for any gentleman. And at the same time as telling him that they had produced these 400, they said that the fee that he would normally receive had been reduced slightly, which he had to be all right. He didn't say a word, but just sat down and signed all 400 of them and handed them over to the printmaker, who said, thank you very much. And then within about 10 minutes was knocking on the door again, because what he had done was to sign all of them, L full stop S full stop LOW, and just leave out the RY of his name. And
I love it. That's brilliant.
So, and he just simply explained that as indeed the price was less, he'd simply reduced the number of letters that he was prepared to sign appropriately. However, if they would like to reinstate the original agreed price, he would add the R and the Y to the end of all of these 400 prints, which is rather good, I think.
That's one of the best stories I've heard in this entire lockdown, Jonathan. I think that sums him up, I think, in one of the best ways possible.
Yeah.
John, we could carry on talking about Lowry all day. And I no doubt once this is over, I'm sure we shall. Unfortunately, not with the ladies and gentlemen joined us here, but probably with a bottle of wine or so. But Jonathan, bear with me 2 seconds. I'm just going to, as I say, we're fairly new on this technology, so I'm just going to attempt to come out of this and actually try and just see if we can access the cameras again and just see if we can have a look at some some questions rather. So just bear with us, ladies and gentlemen.
Sure.
Right, Jonathan, good to see you. Let's see if there are any questions that have actually come in. And thankfully, there aren't. So absolutely fascinating subject matter today, Jonathan. Thank you ever so much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. As I say, I'm sure we could carry on talking about this for days on end, and I'm sure that there are plenty more stories you could probably tell us if we have the time, but unfortunately we don't. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining us again for the Dare Dallas webinar. We'll be doing another one next week at the usual time. We're still not quite sure of the subject matter. If you'd like to drop us an email, and if there is anything that you'd like us to talk about, by all means, please do get in touch. We will speak to you very soon. Take care, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye now. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay.